Hello everyone, Dr. Data Science here to teach you data science methods and tools today, tomorrow, and beyond. In this video, we discuss clustering techniques that aim to group similar instances into clusters, which is an important class of unsupervised learning algorithms. This video will cover a wide range of clustering techniques, including the k-means clustering algorithm, which is one of the simplest and most popular machine learning algorithms, as well as more mathematically involved techniques for handling complex data, such as spectral clustering. Previously, I posted a video discussing the singular value decomposition, or SVD, for metric factorization, which will be extremely useful for better understanding today's topic. I put a link to that video down below. Before we get started, if you are not subscribed, please consider joining the team. Also, please do me a favor and leave me a comment so I can interact with you. Although most of the applications of machine learning today are based on supervised learning, the vast majority of available data is unlabeled. To get some intuition, let's take a look at the iris flower dataset. Like previous videos, we use Google Colab or Google Collaboratory to discuss and implement machine learning methods, which means that you don't have to install and run Python on your own machine. Instead, you will use Google computing resources similar to Google Docs. For more information, you can visit colab.research.google.com to replicate the experiments we have in this video. Now let's get back to the main topic. We import two important data science libraries, NumPy and Scikit-learn, which we show by Scikit-learn. As you can see here, this dataset comes with input features, meaning different attributes such as width and length of various parts related to each flower in our dataset, is stored with the key name data. That's the first key name that we have. Also, this dataset comes with target values and corresponding names. There are three species here, and you see that each flower has been labeled as one of these three species, 0, 1, or 2. Here we have not shown all the labels or target values. This is a typical example of supervised learning, where we are given input features and corresponding labels, and the goal is to predict labels for a new data sample, which is not part of the training dataset. However, this approach is not practical in many modern applications because we need a supervisor or teacher to provide labels for all data points, which becomes time-consuming and costly because of the need for domain expertise. Obviously, a lot of us don't know much about flower species, and we should rely on some domain experts to provide that information. Therefore, the goal of clustering is to find groups of clusters of similar samples without the knowledge of ground truth labels or target values. This means that we have to uncover hidden structures in the data that are not immediately available. Also, remember that we use two-dimensional datasets in this video for illustration purposes, but we usually want to perform unsupervised learning when we are working with high-dimensional data, meaning we have more than a few tens of attributes or features, and we cannot cluster data samples by visualization techniques. To further emphasize the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning, we plot the iris flower dataset in 2 dimensions. On the left, we see that we have a fully labeled dataset, and we use a classification method, here logistic regression, to find decision boundaries to predict the target value for a new sample. However, on the right, we have an unlabeled dataset, and our goal is to find 3 clusters of similar instances in the data. Next, we describe 3 different methods for accomplishing this task. The simplest method for clustering is known as the k-means clustering algorithm. The goal is to obtain a set of cluster centers or centroids that summarize the entire data and we find the closest centroid to each data sample for finding groups of similar instances. To explain this cost function in detail, let's look at the term inside the summation with the red rectangle. For each sample x, which belongs to our dataset shown with curly x, we want to find the closest cluster centroid C, which belongs to the set of all centroids shown with the curly C here. We add these distances together for all samples in our dataset, and the goal is to minimize the sum of squared distances, the blue rectangle here. The main challenge is that we don't have access to the cluster centroids before starting the optimization problem. And in fact, solving this problem exactly is NP hard. Therefore, we have to resort to an approximation method which solves this problem iteratively. This method is known as the Lloyd-Max algorithm, or also known as the K-means clustering algorithm. And the first step is to initialize the set of cluster centers. You can do so by randomly sampling K samples from the dataset, where K is the desired number of clusters. And the main input parameter for K-means is also the number of clusters. Given the initial cluster set, we iterate between two steps. The first step is to find the closest cluster centroid for each data sample, and this will give us a partitioning of data into K clusters. And the second step takes the average of all samples in each partition or cluster to update the centroid. We typically repeat this iterative procedure a few tens of or hundreds of iterations. The K-means clustering algorithm is implemented in the Scikit-learn package, and you can import it from sklearn.cluster, which includes a wide range of clustering techniques. You can find more information by reading the documentation page, and as I mentioned, the most important input argument is the number of clusters, shown here by n_clusters, that you have to specify. In a future video, I will explain how to set various input parameters when applying K-means clustering using Scikit-learn. However, this video mainly focuses on the connections between K-means and spectral clustering and so on. In this slide, I demonstrate how the K-means clustering or the Lloyd-Max algorithm finds a group of similar samples using a synthetic or simulated dataset. The first column shows the updates for 5 centroids or centers, and the second column here demonstrates the partitioning of data, i.e. finding the closest centroid to each sample and the resulting decision boundaries. Also, each row here corresponds to one iteration of K-means clustering. We start by the figure on the top left, figure 1, where we have 5 centroids, and I want you to pay attention to the 2 centroids on the right side. These centroids here are selected randomly. That's one way to initialize the K-means clustering algorithm. On the right side in figure 2, we keep the centroids fixed to find the closest centroid to each sample, which gives us the partitioning of the data, as you can see here with these red decision boundaries. In figure 3, we update the 5 centroids by taking the average of points in each partition. And we repeat this process for the third time. In the last row, we see in figure 5 that the returned cluster centroids are more aligned with the actual center of mass for each cluster, and consequently these centroids provide a better partitioning or clustering of the data in figure 6. We now focus on a more mathematically involved algorithm known as spectral clustering, which allows us to cluster complex datasets that are not linearly separable as in the previous example. The main idea behind spectral clustering is to form a weighted graph or an affinity graph, which is also known as similarity graph. So there are different names that we can use. And in this case, each data point is a node or vertex, and the link or weight between pairs of nodes shows the similarity between them. For example, you can use the Gaussian kernel function, where we have the negative squared distance inside the exponential function. Thus, when the distance is 0, we get 1 because exponential of 0 is equal to 1. Also, remember that exponential of negative x is a decreasing function of x, which means that the similarity between two nodes will decrease as they get farther from each other. Therefore, the Gaussian kernel function here is an appropriate choice. And this allows us to find all weights or connections between nodes in the dataset by forming the similarity graph and its weight matrix that here we denote by W. So this matrix W is an n by n matrix, so it's a square matrix. And the elements are W11 and W1n, N1 and WNN, and the remaining entries. So we have a total of n squared elements or entries here. So now, given the similarity graph that we have, we want to partition the nodes, which are actually the data points, into k groups, which we show them with V1 to Vk. So here we have a simple example that we have two sort of like partitions that we want to find, V1 and V2. And in general, the cost function can be written as the summation over all clusters of W, VL, and VL bar, or VL complement. And what that measures is the total weight to disconnect the group VL from the rest of graph, right? So meaning that here, if I want to disconnect V1 from V2, what is the total weight? So that's what we want to measure. And this obviously cost function works when we have any number of k clusters. And the goal is to minimize this cost function because we want to keep data points or nodes that are similar to each other to still be in the same group. So the goal is to minimize the total weight that we need to disconnect these k groups. So now, like k-means clustering, we can show that we cannot solve this problem exactly, and we have to again resort to approximation methods. So in order to understand the spectral clustering algorithm and the approximate solution, it's important to start by defining the normalized Laplacian matrix. Given the weight matrix or similarity matrix W, we can find the sum of each row. So we have n rows here, and we find the sums, which we show them by D1 to Dn. And then we put these sums on the main diagonal elements of the matrix D. So the matrix D is what is called as the degree matrix, and only has elements on the main diagonal, and each diagonal element corresponds to the sum of the corresponding rows of W. And because this is a diagonal matrix, it's very easy to also find its inverse and also its square root. So you just need to find the negative square root of each diagonal element. So in this way, you can form something that is called the normalized Laplacian matrix. And now you can show that the relaxation of this problem, the approximate solution, can be found by solving this minimization problem of trace U transpose LU. And trace of a matrix is the sum of the diagonal elements, subject to the constraint that U transpose U should be equal to the identity matrix. So this means that the columns of U are orthonormal, meaning that they have unit norm and they're orthogonal to each other. Therefore, when you find U transpose U, we get the identity matrix. And after we find the solution of this problem, we find the optimal U that minimizes this trace. Now we apply the k-means clustering algorithm to the rows of this matrix U. So by construction, this matrix U has n rows. So each row corresponds to one data point or one node. And then each row now has k attributes or features. So now you can think of having n data points in a k-dimensional space where k is the number of clusters. And you apply the k-means clustering algorithm and you find the partitioning of data using this new representation given by the matrix U. However, there is one thing that is left here, and how to find the matrix U. So that's why we need matrix factorization methods. So first of all, let's look at the identity matrix minus the normalized Laplacian matrix, which you can show that this is equal to d minus half w times d minus half. In some sense, what this d minus half w d minus half is the normalized similarity matrix, because w is the similarity matrix that you get by using the sort of like the kernel function, such as the Gaussian kernel function. And this d minus half w d minus half now normalizing this similarity matrix. And now, because this is a symmetric matrix, we can use either singular value decomposition or eigenvalue decomposition. It is more common to use eigenvalue decomposition here. And we write this as P times lambda P transpose, where by definition, lambda is a diagonal matrix that has lambda 1, lambda n on the main diagonal. And we sort them in non-increasing order, meaning that lambda 1 is equal or greater than lambda 2 and so on. So the largest one is the first one. And then the columns of P are also orthonormal. So this is what is known as singular value decomposition or eigenvalue decomposition that I referenced to the video that we had before. And then, in order to find the solution of the optimization problem, we need to look at the eigenvectors associated with the largest k eigenvalues of the matrix d minus half w d minus half. And remember that each eigenvector is an n-dimensional vector. So now we're gonna concatenate these k eigenvectors and we put them as the columns of the matrix U. So this gives us that n by k matrix that we need for performing k-means clustering. So this is sort of like the prototypical case of spectral clustering. There are also other variants where you can, for example, normalize each row of U, or you can use different types of Laplacian metrics, but that's sort of like I would say the most common type of a spectral clustering. Also, if you look at the implementation of a spectral clustering in Scikit-learn, we see that the one that they're using is the one that uses the normalized Laplacian. And also you can create the similarity matrix or affinity matrix using the Gaussian or the radial basis function RBF kernel, which is the exponential of the distance squared, either divided by some constant or multiplied. Doesn't really matter because they're equivalent. And so here, by definition, we are using negative the hyperparameter gamma times the distance squared. And similar to the k-means clustering, you need to give the number of clusters. That's something that we have to specify. And also, if you want to be a little bit more sort of like controlling over this function, you can choose the type of eigensolver because we need to use eigenvalue decomposition. And there's also one option to create a nearest neighbor similarity graph, which means that we are gonna see which points are in the sort of like the nearest neighbor of other instances, but that's one option to use, and the other option, which is the default here, is to use the RBF or the radial basis function. So for more information, you can visit the documentation page, and I will explain these input parameters in more detail in a future video. However, for this video, we want to compare a spectral clustering with k-means clustering. So here on the top row, we have the unlabeled data. So this is the data without any labels, and we would like to find 3 clusters. If we apply k-means clustering, we see that we do not get acceptable results because of the fact that k-means clustering wants to find linearly separable clusters. So now we see that 2 of the clusters are merged together, and that's not acceptable because obviously here we have 3 clusters that are separable. But when we are applying a spectral clustering, we can see that we can correctly identify these 3 clusters. And that's because a spectral clustering is more powerful in terms of recovering different types of clusters. So in order to have a step-by-step implementation, we import NumPy as NP. We also from Scikit-learn.cluster import k-means and a spectral clustering. And we use make blobs to make the data set that we have. So we use the make blobs function, and also here we are using this transformation by multiplying it to the data matrix, because the make blobs creates isotropic data set, meaning that each cluster is spherically distributed. And what we are trying to find here is to make these anisotropic. That's why we are doing this transformation. And we apply both k-means clustering and spectral clustering, and we find the labels, and we plotted both of these results in the previous slide that you saw that a spectral clustering is able to correctly recover those 3 clusters. The third clustering method that we're going to cover is known as the DBSCAN algorithm. And DBSCAN is a little bit different from the previous 2 methods, and it can also be used for recovering nonlinearly separable clusters. The idea behind DBSCAN is that we define clusters as continuous regions of high density. This algorithm computes how many instances or samples are located within a small distance. And we usually call this distance as epsilon. So we find this epsilon neighborhood for each data point. And if there are at least some minimum number of instances in that neighborhood, we call that sample as a core instance, meaning that that's a very important instance that can be used for identifying clusters. And then all samples in the neighborhood of a core instance will belong to the same cluster. To illustrate DBSCAN, we can look at this paper, which was published in 2017, that they revisit DBSCAN and talk about some of the current applications of that. And the goal here is that we set the minimum number of samples to be 4 to declare a point as a core instance. So we see that obviously here A, because of this epsilon neighborhood, which we show here by this circle around it, it's a core instance, and therefore all these data points belong to one cluster. And then the blue one that we see that is labeled as N, that's a noise or outlier, which means that because we don't have any other samples in its epsilon neighborhood. So this method is definitely based on density. And here also you can see that this DBSCAN mainly refers to density-based spatial clustering. And this is also part of Scikit-learn.cluster. like similar to other methods. So now you know that in scikit-learn.cluster you can find k-means, spectral clustering, as well as DBSCAN. And the most important parameter here is this epsilon, which you use to find the core instance, whether a sample is core instance or not. And also you can specify the minimum number of samples in that neighborhood too. But obviously this epsilon is really important. Here we have one example to show you the influence of this epsilon parameter. So on the left, we set epsilon equals to 0.5, which if we go back, that's sort of like the default value. And then on the right, we set it equals to 0.3 with the same number of minimum samples, which is 5. So we can see that on the left, we only find one cluster, which is not acceptable because we have chosen this epsilon to be too large. But by choosing this epsilon to be 0.3 on the right, we can correctly classify cluster the data into two groups. So now we have the blue cluster and the orange cluster. So that shows that epsilon is really important, and that's sort of like the main difficulty of using DBSCAN to find the right epsilon neighborhood to identify core instances. I hope you found this video useful, and thanks for watching.